The cold stone of the cathedral floor seeped through the thin soles of her slippers, a deep, penetrating chill that made the 8-year-old girl shiver. High above, the ceiling vanished into shadow, and the air was thick with incense and the scent of fear sweat from the nobles packed into the gloom. This was not a place for children, yet here she was, Agnes of France, her small hand trembling as a golden ring, heavy, ornate, and sized for a woman, was slid onto her finger. It dangled loosely around her child's digit, a shackle of cold gold. Beside her stood the boy, Alexios II, barely older than her at 13, his own hands shaking as badly as hers. In that moment, in the year 1180, her childhood ended with the scrape of metal against bone. She was a political pawn, and her value was measured not in joy or play, but in dowries and strategic alliances that stretched across continents. This brutal transaction had been set in motion years before Agnes could even comprehend it. Born into the French royal house of Louis VII and Adele of Champagne, she was a political instrument before she drew her first breath. Her father, a man haunted by his failures in the Second Crusade and desperate to counter the rising power of the Angevin Empire, saw a glittering opportunity in the east. The Byzantine emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, needed powerful Western allies to stave off the relentless pressure from the Seljuk Turks on his eastern borders. A marriage alliance with a French princess offered both military credibility and diplomatic leverage. For King Louis, it was a chance to outflank his English rivals, potentially opening a second front that would divert Plantagenet attention away from French soil. The life of his young daughter was the price he was willing to pay for this geopolitical gambit. The negotiations were conducted by men in distant palaces, speaking of territories and trade rights as if arranging the sale of a parcel of land. Byzantine ambassadors arrived at the French court bearing legendary wealth. Silks that shimmered like captured light, spices that perfumed entire rooms, and manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf. They presented a miniature crown to the 7-year-old Agnes during her formal betrothal ceremony. Its weight, though slight to a man, caused her small neck to bow forward as officials recorded the legal formalities that would govern her entire life. Canon law required her consent, but the question posed to a child of 7 was a mere mockery of choice. Her final year in France became a crash course in becoming someone else. Greek tutors, summoned from Constantinople, drilled her in a language whose conjugations and declensions felt alien on her tongue. Their lessons echoed in palace chambers where the sound of foreign words mixed with the rattling of diamond-paned windows. She was taught to eat with golden utensils, to walk with the measured, stately gait of a Byzantine noblewoman, and to prostrate herself before religious icons, a practice foreign to her Latin upbringing. Seamstresses created miniature versions of heavy Byzantine court silks for her to practice moving in, the fabrics swirling around her feet like spilled wine. The theological differences between the Eastern and Western churches were explained with careful diplomacy, focusing on the filioque controversy, a complex dispute over the procession of the Holy Spirit that meant little to a child but would define every religious moment of her future life. The journey to her new home was an epic, traumatic pilgrimage. It carried the young princess through landscapes that unspooled like pages from an illuminated manuscript, from the familiar fields of northern France, through the alpine passes where snow fell in May and the air grew thin, and into an Italy dotted with the ruins of empires even older than the one she was destined to join. The sea voyage from Venice was a particular torment. Mediterranean storms tossed their galley like a toy, and Agnes spent days wretchedly seasick in her cabin, while French diplomats debated aborting the mission altogether. When Constantinople finally emerged from the morning mist, it was a vision from a dream. The city's fabled domes and towers caught the sunlight, throwing back colors too brilliant to be real. The Golden Horn stretched into the city's heart, its waters teeming with Venetian galleys, Genoese traders, and fishing boats, a bustling panorama of a world at the crossroads of everything. The great palace itself defied all her expectations. Where French castles were stout and defensive, this sprawling complex of marble and gold seemed to celebrate magnificent vulnerability, with gardens that stretched to the horizon and fountains that played music with falling water. Her first meeting with Alexios II was a study in overwhelming protocol. The throne room was so vast that whispers became echoes, and the boy emperor sat on the throne of Constantine, his feet not touching the floor, the imperial purple cloth perpetually slipping over his young eyes. They recited scripted phrases in Greek to each other, their voices small and mechanical in the enormous space, neither child daring to look directly at the other. The wedding that followed was a blur of heavy silk, a crown that slid over her eyes, and the haunting, unfamiliar music of Orlos flutes and deep thrumming drums. In the crowd, one pair of eyes watched with calculating intensity. those of Andronicus Komnenos, the emperor's cousin, a man in his late 50s whose dark gaze promised that the children's Pleiad empire would not last. Agnes' wedding night was spent in a vast bed, with Alexios positioned decorously on the far side, both children confused and alone, their union a hollow symbol for a court already looking past the dying boy to the ambitious man waiting in the wings. The grandeur of the Byzantine palace was a gilded cage, its routines as rigid and unyielding as the marble columns that supported its endless halls. For Agnes, life as a child empress was a performance staged from dawn until dusk. She woke before sunrise for prayers in the chapel, her small knees bruising against the cold floor during the prolonged prostrations. Her days were a monotonous cycle of lessons, advanced Greek with impatient tutors who scorned her accent, calligraphy that transformed letters into elaborate art, and the endless drilling of court etiquette. She learned to modulate her voice to a whisper, to adjust her walking pace to match a companion's rank, and to arrange her face into a mask of appropriate solemnity during ceremonies whose meanings eluded her. In this world of calculated gestures, her childhood was a carefully suppressed inconvenience. Meanwhile, the empire she now symbolized was rotting from within. The legendary wealth of Byzantium was a fading echo, its treasury drained by costly wars and the generous trading privileges granted to Italian maritime republics. The military, once the terror of its enemies, now struggled to hold back the Seljuk Turks in the east. The air in the palace was thick with more than incense. It was charged with a palpable anxiety, a silent understanding that the throne was held by a boy who was dying. Alexios's illness manifested in coughing fits that echoed through the corridors, followed by the hurried rustle of servants whisking away silk handkerchiefs spotted with blood. Agnes would sometimes be summoned to his sickbed, holding his fevered hand in hers, two children bound together in a tragedy they were too young to comprehend. It was in this vacuum of power that the figure of Andronicus Komnenos grew from a shadow in the corner to a dominant presence. Nearly 60, with a lifetime of rebellion and exile behind him, he moved through the palace with a predator's confidence. Servants stiffened at his approach. Courtiers fell silent. He began to weave himself into Agnes' life with calculated care. Their encounters started innocuously, a chance meeting in the gardens, where he would explain the history of a particular flower or fountain, his voice a smooth, captivating instrument. He possessed the charm of a seasoned storyteller, making the empire's past glories come alive. Despite her innate unease, Agnes, starved for genuine engagement, found herself looking forward to these lessons. Then, the gifts began to arrive: a delicate ivory comb, a scarf of the finest silk, an illuminated book of hours. Each token was more exquisite than the last, accompanied by notes in elegant Greek calligraphy. These were not simple presents. They were tools of seduction and possession, slowly wrapping her in a web of implied obligation. As Andronicus' influence grew, the ground shifted palpably beneath Agnes' feet. The same courtiers who had once bowed deeply now offered perfunctory nods. Her summons to servants were met with delayed responses. Her tutors subtly altered her curriculum, focusing on subjects like imperial succession, prayers for the dying, and the vocabulary of widowhood and remarriage. The palace itself was preparing for a new master, and she was being prepared for her next role. In September of 1183, the pretense ended. Alexios II succumbed to his illness, though the whispers that slithered through the palace halls spoke of something swifter and more sinister than fever. Agnes, now 12 and a widow, stood beside his golden sarcophagus in the Hagia Sophia. The massive dome seemed to press down on her, the mosaics of watching saints gleaming in the candlelight. She was draped in black silk, a widow's veil misting over her hair, her small figure nearly swallowed by the grandeur of the funeral rite. She performed the gestures of grief she had been taught, but her emotions were a locked box of confusion and fear. Andronicus wasted no time. The period of mourning was brutally short. Within days, he declared himself emperor, and, in the same breath, his intention to marry the young dowager empress. The announcement was made during a feast in the great hall. Agnes, still in mourning black, sat at the high table as Andronicus rose to outline his military ambitions and plans for the empire. Almost as an afterthought, he declared his intent to marry her, as if she were a piece of imperial property, transferring ownership along with the throne and the crown jewels. The assembled nobility responded with dutiful applause. No one asked for her opinion. In the brutal mathematics of power, her consent was irrelevant. Her value lay in her bloodline, which connected Andronicus' usurpation to the legitimate French royal house, and in her body, which he now claimed as his right. The second wedding was a coronation of possession, not a celebration of union. In October of 1183, less than a month after burying her first husband, Agnes stood once more in the Hagia Sophia, this time draped not in the somber black of mourning but in the imperial purple and gold of a bride. The crown they placed on her head was no longer loose. It fit perfectly, its weight a familiar oppression. As she walked the long aisle, she saw Andronicus waiting at the altar, his grey-streaked beard meticulously groomed, his dark eyes fixed on her with a satisfaction that made her stomach clench. This time, she understood the Greek words of the Orthodox ceremony, and understanding brought no comfort, only a cold, clear comprehension of her powerlessness. The ring he slid onto her finger was sized for her 12-year-old hand, a perfect fit for a cage that was now closing permanently around her. The wedding night was a brutal education in the realities of her new existence. It was an exercise in domination, a stark lesson that her body was not her own but a territory to be claimed, a symbol of authority to be conquered. The following morning, palace physicians arrived to clinically confirm the consummation, reducing her trauma to a political formality. Life as Andronicus' Empress was a relentless performance. She was required at his side during military briefings and diplomatic receptions, a silent ornament to legitimize his rule. She learned to anticipate his mercurial temper, to modulate her expressions, and to offer the appearance of wifely devotion while retreating into a shell of internal silence. The palace, under his rule, grew thick with paranoia. Servants vanished, accused of treason on mere whispers. The once magnificent halls now echoed with fear, and Agnes learned that a careless word or a misplaced glance could have dire consequences. Andronicus' reign proved as violent and unstable as his ascent. His military campaigns drained the treasury for little gain, his domestic policies alienated the nobility and the people, and his paranoia festered into a tyranny that turned Constantinople against him. Agnes watched from the epicenter of the storm, a passenger on a ship she knew was sinking. Through 1184 and 1185, reports of rebellion and defeat flooded the palace. The air in the city grew heavy with unrest, and the loyalty of the palace guards became a fleeting, uncertain thing. The end came with the ugly roar of a mob. In September 1185, the citizens of Constantinople, pushed beyond endurance, stormed the palace. Agnes heard the splintering of wood, the shattering of glass, and the terrifying sound of unchecked vengeance. Andronicus, attempting to flee, was captured. The man who had claimed an empire through marriage and murder was dragged through the very streets he had once paraded through, subjected to a brutal and humiliating death. Agnes, barricaded in her chambers, was spared the sight but not the sounds, a brutal symphony marking the end of her second marriage. At 14, she was a widow for the second time, a survivor of 2 emperors and a usurper. The new emperor, Isaac II, Angelos, faced the question of what to do with her. She was a political liability, a connection to the hated regime, but also a French princess whose murder could provoke a Western war. For months, she lived under a form of house arrest, her fate once again the subject of distant negotiations. Finally, an agreement was reached with her half-brother, Philip II Augustus of France. In 1186, Agnes boarded a French ship and watched the glittering skyline of Constantinople recede into the haze. The city that had been her gilded cage, her school of survival, and the stage for her trauma vanished from view. Her return to France was both a homecoming and an exile. She spoke Greek more fluently than French. Her manners were those of the Byzantine court, and her soul carried the scars of experiences her French contemporaries could scarcely imagine. She was granted estates and a title, but she remained on the periphery of a world that had moved on without her. Agnes never remarried, despite offers. She lived out her days in relative obscurity, managing her lands and her memories, a living relic of a failed political gambit. She lived long enough to receive the news in 1204 that the army of the Fourth Crusade, the very Western powers her first marriage was meant to ally, had brutally sacked Constantinople, finally destroying the empire she had briefly ruled. The news must have carried a bitter, tragic resonance. The child who had been traded for an alliance had outlived the empire itself, a final, poignant testament to the emptiness of the calculations that had stolen her childhood. Thank you for watching this tragic tale of Agnes of France. If you were moved by the story of this child empress, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into the hidden lives of historical figures. Let us know in the comments which other forgotten stories you'd like us to explore next.